You can mess up over and over again, and the whole world loves you.
Mike.
You'll never know what it's like to fail.
Right, I'll tell you what, you fat little...
So recently there's been a lot of discussion surrounding The Incredibles on Twitter. I will call it X when the feds come knocking. Specifically about how, pardon me, incredibly written the film was, how dark it was, how it's the best movie ever and everyone else should stop trying. And a natural evolution of this discussion was tackling the film's sequel released in 2018. Because despite many people acknowledging that Incredibles 2 is a perfectly serviceable film of great action, animation and funny dialogue, a lot of people greatly dislike it. With many of the reasons being that, in comparison to the original, it lacks a great amount of the sauce the original had. Nowhere near as mature, willing to take risks, just generally not as sharply written all around, and being a pretty big letdown. Not at all incomprehensible given it was released nearly 15 years after the first movie. And while all of this discussion was incredibly interesting to see and very entertaining to read, something started to become clear to me. Now, I wasn't suddenly hit with the revelation that Pixar sequels are controversial. I think anyone that's been paying attention to conversations surrounding Pixar over the last few years knows that by now, but I was curious as to just how bad a lot of these movies actually were, because a lot of people admitted that Incredibles 2 was a perfectly fine movie on its own. It was mostly the areas where it fell short of the original that people had a problem with, and tends to be why many dislike it. I'm not above taking pot shots at Pixar sequels. I made a Pixar video last year with an entire section dedicated to their over-reliance on making them, and being hit with a wave of depression upon realizing people unironically like Cars 2 and haven't been shot. But today I wanted to take a look at Pixar sequels in no particular order, and looking at them as both standalone films and then looking at how they measure up compared to the originals. A lot of these films have incredibly poor reputations, but in a select few cases I do think people are being a little too harsh on them, as much as they end up being pointless and disappointing cash grabs at the end of the day. So let's take a look, let's get this video started already. Are Pixar sequels really that bad? Except Cars 2, that film can still blow me. When it comes to Pixar sequels, you'd be hard-pressed to find one more contentious than Toy Story 4, because holy shit, people hate this movie, dude. Like, I personally am not a fan of it by any metric, but the sheer unabashed hatred people have in their souls towards this film is actually pretty impressive, to the point where some people unironically tried arguing with me when I made fun of that infamous 6-hour-long review some guy made about the movie, and trying to convince me that the same guy who streamed himself getting angry at his chat over Sonic Heroes wasn't slightly unhinged.
And I'm aware about Homie attacking the crystals, I'm doing it and it's not fun.
And I'm not gonna lie, while I personally don't see anything in this film that would cause me to go on a 10-minute rant about some guy losing his car keys, I completely understand and relate to a lot of the frustration around this film's mere existence. Toy Story was the first Pixar franchise to be given a sequel, and it was the only franchise they had that got sequels until after Toy Story 3 released, where it was then officially open season for anything people had nostalgia for. And Toy Story 2 and 3 are genuinely earnest and fantastic films in their own right, and are among some of the greatest sequels ever made, with most people agreeing that they're actually better than the first movie, and I agree wholeheartedly. Toy Story 2 may be my favorite, but 3, I don't need to go on and on about why people love 3, but it's such a beautiful conclusion that wrapped everything up near flawlessly. So naturally, the announcement of Toy Story 4 was a bit of a shock to the system. I distinctly remember being on a bus and some guy in his 40s started screaming his lungs out as if Al-Qaeda had returned. Disney adults, man, not even once. I'm surprised I survived my visit to Disneyland last year without turning to dust. Actually, now that I think about it, that guy was probably really extremely baked. Back to the topic at hand, many people were against Toy Story 4 from the very beginning, which speaks volumes to just how beloved Toy Story 3 was as a conclusion. There wasn't a whole lot you could really do from this point onwards without ruining that sense of finality. And when the film finally released, while it received critical acclaim, you're not going to find many people online calling it a good sequel or a particularly great installment in the franchise, as a lot of people's fears about the film ruining Toy Story 3's conclusion were confirmed and amplified. But first, the film itself. Looking at this film completely divorced from the rest of the franchise, it's okay. I mean, obviously there are good aspects of this film, but I rarely see anyone mention how funny the film is. Pixar's comedic writing is one of the few saving graces of many of their films these days, except when it isn't. And Toy Story 4's comedy is pretty sharp overall. I think it's way funnier than 3 at least, and the new side characters are all fun. The film is just absolutely stunning to look at as well. Pixar having good animation is kind of a no-shit moment, but Toy Story 4 is probably their best looking film to date. While I am getting tired of their trademark overly realistic animation style, it works a lot better with Toy Story than most of their other projects, and on top of this film having some genuinely great cinematography as well. And when you look at the film's plot in isolation, it's genuinely pretty emotionally effective. What people take issue with is the fact that this is a sequel to Toy Story 3 and an installment in the Toy Story franchise. So while the film itself is alright, it does a lot of things wrong when it comes to the characters and story. Pretty much the entire iconic supporting cast of the franchise is relegated to cameos and nothing else. The characterization of Buzz is a complete slap in the face to anyone who was invested in him after watching him grow, basically throwing nearly nearly all of his character development out the window and turning him into a bumbling comedic relief moron who has no impact on the story. Woody's dilemma in this movie over choosing being a free toy with Bo Peep or staying with Bonnie and his friends is not only a complete retread of what Toy Story 2 did, it also leads to Woody choosing Bo Peep and his freedom over his loyalty to Bonnie, which felt like a completely out of nowhere 180 for his character. I get that Toy Story 4 tries to emphasize Woody's age and how tired he is a lot, but the core part of Woody's character that Toy Story 2 emphasized was his loyalty and his compassion. He gave up the chance to be more than just a kid's toy so he could help and watch Andy grow up. So even though this ending is a powerful emotional gut punch, it left a lot of people crying for the wrong reasons. I could go over some other issues with the film's writing, but it's mainly how the film treats its characters that rub people the wrong way, and why it's often considered the worst in the franchise. I don't think Toy Story 4 is a bad film in the slightest. It's a very entertaining and emotionally earnest film, but there's only so much radical change in characterization you can get away with in a franchise that spans nearly 30 years. Okay, I'm just gonna throw a wrench in the works of this video structure already because I need to be completely unfiltered, 100% factual and real with you guys here. What the f do people value so much in Cars? Not saying Cars 1 is a bad movie, but even when considering its sequel's less than stellar reputation, I can't find much that the film really disappoints with it compared to the first. I guess it's just a case of Cars 1 being a much more solid film, but even if you were the world's most devoted believer in the Church of Owen Wilson, I doubt there's much of the hell, that's a sentence, Jesus Christ. But even if you were the world's most devoted believer in the Church of Owen Wilson, I doubt there's much about this sequel you could find to be offensively awful in comparison to the first. Cars 2 is just a poorly written film and that's about it really. I guess I like Mater's character arc, but that's all there is to it honestly. I'll say right now that the action scenes in this film absolutely kick ass. If there's one thing I'll give constant praise to Cars 2 for, it's the spy movie angle. It's such a radical departure from the first film's tone and story, and objectively speaking that's a massive problem. And it's completely ridiculous that all of this 007 style bullshit is being done with sentient cars, yet it somehow works really well. And I don't know who told the music guys to go all out because Christ, this film has a good soundtrack. Again, going with a lot of spy influence and it works. My God, it works. Finn McMissile's theme is an actual hood classic. That bass line is good. It's so good. Why is it so good? That's where my praise for Cars 2 ends, because while I'll admit the film is entertaining, it is not a good film. The film struggles to balance both McQueen and Mater's plot lines, with Mater's completely overshadowing McQueen's, despite his giant red chin taking up 50% of the poster. The film's story overall is riddled with holes. Not conceptual holes like, oh, how do the cars in Cars work? Why did these two cars flash their breaths at Lightning McQueen? Because those questions are lame and the sequel clearly does not care. The story just generally makes no sense. Everyone in the story is just a complete idiot, and the film somehow feels more juvenile than the first Cars, which even at the time was seen as incredibly pedestrian by Pixar standards despite being a positively received film. I can enjoy Cars 2 ironically, and I do get a kick out of the spy stuff, but I still think it's more than deserving of its reputation, and I'd say it's the only Pixar film I can call truly awful. Now, Cars 3 is a film I tend to forget exists. Know what I can't forget though? This teaser trailer. Yeah, everyone said it already, but why did this go so hard? Why did they go so hard on this teaser trailer? It's so dark. Cars 3 is not a movie deserving of this teaser trailer. It is miles better than 2, like genuinely by a long shot, and actually possesses a shocking amount of emotional depth. Yes, emotional depth in Cars. Please don't leave. Like, there's a lot of pretty touching scenes in this, and it works very well as a conclusion to the Cars trilogy. You know, for however long it remains a trilogy for. It completely throws away the spy stuff from Cars 2 and goes back to the first film's themes, and honestly, if it wasn't for the first film being a much more solid film overall, I would have greatly preferred if the Cars franchise stuck to this sports biopic approach. This story about Lightning being past his prime and desiring to prove that he can still race is a great idea, and it's a very poignant story. The problem is that Cars 3 is an absolute snooze fest, and though it definitely has the best story in the trilogy, it greatly lacks the entertainment value. And while I don't need keys jingling in front of me to keep watching a film, I love myself a good drama and biopic here and there, Cars 3 does very little to keep my attention or keep me awake. I don't have much else to say about the Cars sequels honestly, but I had to break away from the structure of the video for a second to talk about them properly. Okay, so I need to put a trigger warning here. Sorry about this, but not everyone is ready to be exposed to Ellen DeGeneres today. You know, it's actually pretty depressing how little people talk about Finding Nemo in comparison to everything else Pixar has made, and it's not for any negative reasons. Finding Nemo is universally beloved, with a lot of people considering it a contender for Pixar's best film, but it overall isn't really talked about too much. People just see it as the masterpiece it is and don't really debate anything about it, which is super rare honestly. Finding Nemo is one of Pixar's most beautiful films, from the animation that hasn't aged a day to its incredible atmosphere atmosphere and score, and its absolute sucker punch of a story that has stuck with me for my entire life. If The Incredibles didn't exist, Finding Nemo would be my favorite Pixar movie, period. It left a massive impact on me when I was little, and I still think it's one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. Now, a sequel to Finding Nemo was hotly anticipated for a while, and I remember constantly reading news about it when I was using the iPads at school, and I didn't really care about the fact that it seemed unnecessary. I was just a kid who wanted a sequel to one of his favorite movies. I was absolutely ecstatic when Finding Dory was announced, and after I first watched it, I genuinely loved it and considered it to be on par with the first. I was like 12, so bear with me. Years go by though, and while I can't shake my love for this film off, I can definitely see why many are so critical of it. First of all, the film itself is, like Toy Story 4, completely fine. There's really nothing that wrong with it. As expected, the film is stunning to look at, considering a lot of the story takes place in much more detailed locations than the first movie did. Despite a few dialogue hiccups, it's a solid narrative about disability, and it still has plenty of the emotional heft that Finding Nemo had. Side characters like Hank were fantastic, the callbacks to Finding Nemo are appreciated if a little forced, the ending is sweet, the film is cute, it's solid, it's fine. But it lacks a lot of the tension and drama that Nemo had, and overall is retreading a lot of the same ground. It hits a lot of similar story beats, not helped by the constant callbacks to the first film that do get egregious after a while because you can tell they were mostly there for nostalgia purposes, and generally, while having Dory as the protagonist this time is an interesting idea, and her short-term memory loss can make the story more interesting, it eventually becomes more clear that she kinda struggles to carry an entire movie when she's the main focus. I love Dory, I struggle to find anyone who doesn't, but it's very clear she was made to be a secondary protagonist to Marlin, and her short-term memory loss, while thoughtfully handled by the film, is basically just a plot device. Not much else to say. I think Finding Dory is a little overhated. It's alright, it definitely doesn't disrespect the previous film or fail in areas that the first film succeeded in. It's mostly just a case of it feeling way too samey and predictable. It's a disappointing sequel. Not a bad one though. Here it is. Here's the one that kickstarted this whole fuck, I hit my desk. I've made it no secret that The Incredibles is tied with Ratatouille and Finding Nemo as not just my favorite Pixar movie, but one of my favorite movies ever. There's no debate here. You know how good this movie is, I know how good this movie is, let's just dive into the sequel. This is another case where the film is infinitely better as a standalone film than as a sequel, and I hope you guys have spotted that pattern by now. Pixar sequels tend to be completely fine films on their own, still being skillfully written and fun distractions with spectacular animation. The main reason they're so hated is specifically because being a fine sequel years after the original installment is either simply not enough, or the sequel does some stuff that falls drastically short of the first movie. Order Cars 2. The entire world exploded with hype when Incredibles 2 was finally announced. Out of Pixar's entire catalogue of films, The Incredibles was basically the only film people were begging for a sequel to. And even though the original film ended on a satisfying note, there was still a lot more that could have been done with this world. New opportunities to satirize, analyze, and explore the concept of superhero movies like the first film did. Brad Bird, in a now infamous quote, stated he would only do a second Incredibles film if he found a story that was worthy of being told. So I think you can understand that finally seeing Incredibles 2 happen was immensely exciting, and many, understandably, had high expectations. Not just because the original was a masterpiece, but because many were curious about what the story would be like if it was so good that Brad Bird decided to finally make a sequel after 14 years. It's not a stretch to say this was Pixar's most hyped up release ever. It absolutely dominated the box office, and is still Pixar's highest earning film to date, which is why a lot of people really don't like this film, because despite all of the hype and the sky-high expectations people had for it, Incredibles 2 fell spectacularly short of the first movie. In fact, it fell stupendously short. You can tell these films were written and directed by the same guy, but there were so many aspects that felt incredibly off. Firstly, as a film, Incredibles 2 is once again just fine. In fact, I'd go as far as saying it's a much better film than Finding Dory and Toy Story 4. The distinct and striking art style of The Incredibles absolutely flourishes here. The film looks drop-dead gorgeous, and the action scenes are definitely one of the film's greatest strengths. I'm of the opinion that Brad Bird is one of the greatest action directors working in animation. He has consistently proven that he knows his shit when it comes to the medium, and Incredibles 2 regularly flexes his skills. Incredibles 2 is also incredibly funny. While the story itself may not be as cleverly written, Bird's wit is still just as sharp as it was back in 2004, and I'll go on record saying this is one of Pixar's funniest movies. The soundtrack brings back the absolutely glorious jazz from the first film, and overall Incredibles 2 is a fairly decent, dare I say, good superhero film with memorable action set pieces, stunning visuals, and a killer soundtrack. But the reason why this movie fails is because while all these aspects are absolutely top-notch, watch, the story is such a shallow disappointment when compared to the first, and the film overall feels defanged. It lacks the mature edge that the first film had. There's rarely a quiet scene here, and certainly nothing that comes close to being as dark as the first film was. The darkness and maturity of the first film wasn't superficial or edgy, it was subversive and helped to ground the film, showing realistic consequences of a superhero police society. I mean, the film literally opens with someone jumping to their death and then suing the guy who saved him. The tone of The Incredibles wasn't gloomy or anything, it was still a family film at the end of the day, but there is no scene in Incredibles 2 that even comes close to matching the first. The story doesn't really do anything new or acts as a satirization or analyzation of any superhero stories like the first film did. In fact, I'll just say this now, Incredibles 2 feels like the exact kind of story the first film relentlessly mocked throughout its entire runtime. The Incredibles was incredibly sharp, it was a thoughtful commentary on superhero narratives while simultaneously completely outclassing every superhero film to come before and after it. Take breaths when you're recording, you idiot. Despite being a superhero story, it grounded itself in realism. It was a smartly written subversion of the genre. Incredibles 2, by comparison, doesn't really do anything to subvert the genre and feels pedestrian by comparison. It literally has a scene where the big villain of the movie starts monologuing and expositing their entire evil plan in front of the hero, and it's treated as this big dramatic story reveal when this exact scene was the subject of f***ing parody in the first movie.
You sly dog! You got me monologuing! I can't believe it.
Like, how do you write this scene without realizing you made fun of this exact scenario over a decade ago? And even when you aren't comparing this film to the first, the story just falls apart. The screenslaver, or Evelyn, is such an awful villain. Syndrome runs circles around her without even trying. The reveal is predictable. The only thing you're left to guess is which one of the Endeavor siblings ends up being the screenslaver, because they're the only ones who can actually be them. It's such a lazy twist for a villain who already sucked in comparison to Syndrome. Frozone basically does nothing for the entire film. The film generally lacks the higher stakes that every action scene in the first one had. Generally, the film feels so much lighter than the first, and it's a massive disappointment. Especially when you see the deleted scenes showing Gazer Beam's funeral, acknowledging Syndrome's genocide of superheroes while keeping the tone incredibly similar to the first movie. It's a beautifully done scene, and it's just removed from the finished movie. In fact, this movie being set immediately after the first ended is a massive mistake because of how different they feel, and also because the video game did the same thing. Overall, it's not a shock why Incredibles 2 was such a disappointment. It had a ton of potential, a ton of hype leading up to release, and ultimately settled for a by-the-numbers story that kept the style and feel of the franchise, but lacked the intelligence, tone, and spark of its predecessor. Monsters University is a film that I tend to struggle comprehending the fact that it was a thing that happened at one point, and the general consensus is that it's a very inoffensive film that, besides some striking continuity errors when you consider it's a prequel for Monsters Inc., isn't really all that special. These people are wrong, because there's a reason I chose not to end this video on Incredibles 2, which you would assume would be the predictable choice, but alas, you've been hoodwinked. Monsters University is a film that I think is pretty damn underrated, and I'll get to why in a sec. Actually, starting now. I don't know why I gave this video a structure, this is so much easier. No, Monsters University is not nearly as good as Monsters Inc. I will just say that now. But Monsters University tells an incredibly honest and realistic story that deserves far more praise and attention. It zones in on the realistic nature of the dreams you have as a kid, the stuff you want to accomplish, the things you want to become, and focuses on how some people, no matter how hard they try and how hard they dream, they won't be able to accomplish those dreams. It's an ugly truth that a lot of stories tend to shy away from because it's unpleasant to think about, that you could invest so much time and effort into something for years only to come up short and fail. I tend to prefer far more optimistic and hopeful stories because I generally think people need stuff like that more than ever, but the prospect of failing at something you've dreamt about accomplishing for so long is a very real fear and something that happens to a lot of people, and I greatly respect this movie for acknowledging this. But while it acknowledges this harsh reality, it doesn't wallow in depression or act as if everything is hopeless. It knows that there are always other avenues you can take in life that you can excel in, that can lead to greater opportunities in the future, and that you don't need to be tied down by the dreams you had as a kid, and to believe that you are forever going to be a failure if you don't achieve them. Honestly, the scene where Mike and Sully sit alone at the river might be one of the greatest scenes in any Pixar film, period. Both of them acknowledging that they failed to achieve their dreams. Mike aced every test and knew the art of scaring inside and out, yet had to face the fact that he just wasn't scary. Sully was a natural scarer and had an advantage over everyone in his class, yet he still failed at every test, got kicked out of the scare program, and ultimately brought shame to himself. This is a film that's definitely going to hit harder for teens and young adults than it will for younger kids, honestly, as if the university setting wasn't enough. This is one of the strongest conclusions to any Pixar film, and it would have solidified this movie as one of Pixar's greatest if the first 2/3 of the film were at that same level, but the rest of the film outside of the third act is just okay. I genuinely think this is a good movie and that people should give more credit, and it's 100% the best Pixar sequel outside of Toy Story 2 and 3. So, overall, would I say Pixar sequels are overhated? Maybe a little. Nearly all of these films are perfectly fine, but I completely understand and actually share a lot of the hatred people have towards them as sequels. They fall incredibly short of the already lofty expectations people naturally have for them, and with Toy Story 5 and Inside Out 2 on the way, I can't say I'm super optimistic for Pixar's future, but who knows, they could very well surprise me. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Play Yakuza.